The onus is really on African governments. They have to be more ambitious. They have to raise their game on growth. Growing by 3%, when your population growth is around 3%, doesn't really help. You don't reduce poverty. You don't create enough jobs when you're growing at that level. You need to raise your game on growth. You grow by 6, 7%. You start to increase the pie.
You've just started your new role as VP for Eastern and Southern Africa, but you know East Asia very well. So I thought maybe we could start there and ask you, how did they square this tricky circle of state and market? What's their secret?
Well, I think pragmatism. East Asian governments have been extremely pragmatic. They recognize the importance of states enabling everything, enabling development, but they also recognize the limitations of states' actions. But at the same time, they come up with a strategy that takes into account market failures, because if you have 100% faith in market, where there are some market failures, such as information gap, lack of public goods, etc., you don't get what you want. So that's the rationale for their interventions. But at the same time, they recognize that without working with the private sector, there are many things that you cannot achieve. And if you look at all East Asian countries, or most of them, regardless of the nature of the regime, they have leveraged private sector very effectively to create jobs and to grow their economy.
How can African countries learn from that experience?
No, I think African countries are already on that path. Perhaps what we need is to be more deliberate about that relationship between the private sector and the public sector, and to be more consistent across it, right? So, so my sense is that at this stage, without that productive alliance, or that in this forum you call it New Deal, or partnership between the public and the private sector, a lot of the things that we want to see in Africa will be very slow to achieve, right? Because government doesn't have enough resources, and private sector has access to resources. Government doesn't necessarily has the expertise to do certain things that the private sector can do. And finally, private sector, and when we talk about private sector, it's not just the domestic private sector. You can also leverage global investors that have more resources, access to market, technology. You can leverage them for the benefit of your country. So what we are seeing in Africa, we cannot say that Africans are not doing it. I think they should perhaps raise their game in this area, and they should, I think, be bolder and be more specific in this partnership with the private sector.
Are there ways that governments, for example, in East Africa, who want to tap into Asian demand, they think, okay, there's middle classes emerging, there's Beijing supermarkets which deserve to have Kenyan coffee products or Rwandan. In fact, I believe the Rwandan Development Board has helped in the tricky marketing and packaging so that they can send things directly to China. If there was going to be this new deal, this partnership, what would that look like in this sort of concrete example of Asian demand and East African produce?
Now, I very much believe that this is possible and it will happen, but it won't be automatic, right? I think government will have to do the hard work of putting in place the right environment for that to happen. You need the basic infrastructure, right? If you want to do this export to Beijing, as you mentioned, at scale, you have to have power. It is really critical for the private sector and businesses in Africa to be able to access reliable electricity and affordable electricity so that they can compete with others. Penetrating the Beijing market is not something that only African businesses are eyeing. African businesses will have to compete with businesses from other continents and even within Asia itself. So, and if those competitors have access to better power and more affordable power, there's no way you will be competitive in the Beijing market. You won't be even competitive in your own market, not to mention there. And that's why Africa imports a lot, because others are able to supply to customers. And I would mention also the importance of the regional market, because sometimes before you get all the way to Beijing, which can be very complicated, your proximate markets are the markets in the region. But the tariff barriers, the non-tariff barriers, the lack of cross-border connectivity, all of those are obstacles that prevent that firm in Rwanda to export in the local regional market, not to mention to Beijing. I think all of that is relatively well known. It's about executing, doing it, right? And the World Bank is very, very committed and has been working very hard as a group with World Bank, IFC, and MIGA together, combining all our tools and instruments to support countries to do that. We have seen some countries that have actually made progress in that area, but we are very far from where we should be in terms of putting in place the right environment for job creation, growth, and exports.
So let's drill down on that execution piece, especially on infrastructure, because it does seem to be the thing which is holding the continent back, making the price of bringing a container in or out so high, reaching. I think Côte d'Ivoire is a fantastic exception. They've managed to push tarmacked roads well into the interior, secondary roads as well. So it's now, if you go to the markets here, you won't be paying crazy prices for the produce because it's easier to get it up and down. So suddenly you're connecting the markets in Abidjan to the fields around Korogo, and that's great news. But it's not the case in many, many other African countries. And then the block to getting a good pipeline of infrastructure projects appears to be the lack of developers. It seems to be very hard to get the people who can do those early stage work for infrastructure projects. How do we finance 10 or 20 AFCs? They're a good project developer. How do we get 1,000 of these on the continent?
No, I would say that there are lots of interest in developing that in Africa, because Africa has the largest infrastructure gap, therefore the largest opportunities for investment in the world. And the return on investing in infrastructure in Africa, once it is properly de-risked, is very high. Right? The risk-adjusted return on investing in any infrastructure, in most infrastructure areas in Africa, is very, very high, as some of the investors that have invested could tell you. Now, the challenge is that, we are coming back to this partnership between public sector and private sector. For many areas of infrastructure, if as a private developer, I actually make my calculation, given the price of electricity that is in the market or the price of water, it may not be profitable for me to make that investment. So somebody has to make my investment viable. And that's where the partnership can come in, because I'm bringing capital, but if my investment is not de-risked, and if my investment is not viable, I will not be able to do it. And we have great examples. For example, in the power sector, there's this very big project in Nigeria whereby there's a boom in mini-grid development right now. Why? Because the World Bank and the government of Nigeria have found a way to make that investment viable using a result-based approach, whereby once you collect a village, the World Bank will provide this sort of viability grant that allows you to break even. We also have examples in the road sector and even in the water sector. I think those these are proven cost-effective solutions that just can be scaled up. And if we scale those initiatives, I think that's how we can reach some of those targets we have for infrastructure in development in Africa. For example, as part of the Mission 300, which is an initiative led by World Bank, FDB, SE for All, and many other partners. And the target is to really help provide electricity to 300 million Africans by 2030.
So, final question. The Africa Report is 20 years old this year. We've been seeing, since we began in 2005, some fantastic growth stories. What for you, looking forward now, in the next 20 years, what are the bets which are being made now, which are going to pay off in 10 years, 20 years?
20 years. Now, first of all, let me say that I'm very optimistic that the next 20, 25 years could be the Africa's time. Look at demographics. We have really lots of opportunities. Look at demographics. Africa will be responsible for 90% increase, global increase in the workforce population. And the workforce population in Africa will double, right? You look at critical mineral and all these resources, we have it in abundance in Africa. Look at African entrepreneurs, young and old. They innovate. They have very good ideas, and they want to conquer the world. But all of that will not happen automatically. I think African government will have to really do the right reforms to realize this potential, right? They need to invest in the human capital of Africans, the education, the health, and the nutrition. Between now and 2050, almost 1 billion new Africans will be born. If you make sure that every one of those child that will be born between today and only 25 years ago, if you invest, make sure that every one of them has good nutrition, good education, good health, you have a labor force in a couple of decades that can transform the world. They can innovate. They have the skills to industrialize Africa. They have the skills to transform Africa. You need to invest in the human capital. So my sense is that the onus is really on African governments. They have to be more ambitious. They have to raise their game on growth. Growing by 3%, when your population growth is around 3%, doesn't really help. You don't reduce poverty. You don't create enough job when you're growing at that level. You need to raise your game on growth. You grow by 6, 7%. You start to increase the pie, right? And without such growth, firms will not be able to hire that much. Startups will not be able to scale, right? And even the government will not have the fiscal muscles to invest in those very foundation of the private sector-led growth, such as those infrastructure that I mentioned, power, road. Growth will not be the solution to everything, but it will really enable the environment. And at the root of many of the challenges many African countries are managing right now, it's just low growth, right? It really gives you the margin of maneuver to manage shocks, to manage your debt in a comfortable way, and to also create jobs and create prosperity. Now, having said that, I think it is really important to also for government to be very proactive to make sure that growth is inclusive. Because what we see in many countries is that you may have the 6 or 7% growth, but a lot of people in the country are disconnected from that growth.